big business, and labor. So today we're going to talk about a couple of kind of deeper philosophical questions, and one of them has to do with something called social Darwinism. So I'd like you to just kind of plant the seed in your brain of, when you are driving along through town, panhandler along the side of the road, gut check, what's the first couple of things that you think about? And we will come back to that after we've talked about social Darwinism. So some quick backstory behind Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland to penniless parents, or hardworking parents at the least. His father had worked in the textile industry as one of those people that was doing early hand looming, and when the Industrial Revolution came to the area, it replaced hand loom workers, and as a result, the family was in transition. Andrew Carnegie came from Dunfermline, Scotland. This was supposedly the original residence. Dunfermline, Scotland, in 1848, when he was 11 or 12 years old. At 12 years old, he got a job as a bobbin boy in a textile mill in the United States and was making about $1.20 a week. He worked his way up and became eventually a private secretary to a local superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad named Thomas Scott. That's Thomas Scott there standing. He was just kind of found himself in the right place at the wrong time, the right place at the right time. And he'd gained a little bit of notoriety supposedly when he was young, and this story is a little bit hard to actually verify, but the story goes that he found money in the street and decided to actually turn it over to somebody and try to find the rightful owner. And at that point, Andrew Carnegie kind of got some notoriety in his local community for being an honest little fella. And that stuck with him and provided him with a couple of opportunities early on, including this assistant's job. One morning when Thomas Scott was out of town, a railroad incident occurred, and Carnegie single-handedly relayed messages that unsnarled a tangle of freight and passenger trains. He didn't really have the permission to do that, but he took it upon himself to do it anyway. His boss, Thomas Scott, could have fired him, but instead rewarded Carnegie by giving him a chance to buy stock in the company. Carnegie's mother mortgaged the family home to make the purchase possible, and soon Carnegie received his very first dividend. These are Andrew Carnegie's words in his own autobiography, and he says, "One morning a white envelope was lying on my desk, addressed in a big signature, to Andrew Carnegie, Esquire. All it contained was a check for $10 upon the Gold Exchange Bank of New York, and I shall remember that check as long as I live. It gave me the first penny of revenue from capital, something that I hadn't worked for with my own sweat of the brow. Eureka, I cried, here is the goose that lays the golden eggs." Andrew Carnegie was one of the very first industrial moguls to make his own fortune. It was actually relatively unusual for somebody to rise from rags to riches, but Andrew Carnegie is an example of that. His rise from rags to riches, along with his passion for supporting charities, made him a model of an American success story. And the castle in the top right of the corner of your screen now is that castle in Dunfermline, Scotland, that Carnegie bought and built after he made his will. So returned home and replaced this with this. But how did he do it? So by 1865, Carnegie was so busy managing the money that he had earned in dividends that he happily left his job at the Pennsylvania Railroad and entered the steel business. In 1873, he had toured a British steel mill, witnessed the awesome kind of spectacle of the Bessemer process in action. And by 1899, the Carnegie Steel Company manufactured more steel than all the factories in Great Britain. Carnegie had some new business strategies that he set a precedent for other companies that followed. Carnegie's success was due in part to management practices that he initiated and that soon became widespread. First, he continually sought out ways to make better products more cheaply. He spent a lot of the profits that the company made in research and technology, constantly looking for more innovation and increasing it and willing to spend money on updating the technology in his factories to make sure that he was staying as efficient as possible. He incorporated new machinery, new techniques such as accounting systems that enabled him to track precise costs. He attracted talented people by offering them stock in the company and then encouraged them to compete against one another. In addition to improving his own manufacturing operation, Carnegie attempted to control as much of the steel as he could. He did this mainly by something called vertical integration, a process in which he bought out his suppliers, the coal fields, the iron mines, the ore freighters, and the railroad lines in order to control the raw materials and the transportation systems needed to get his raw product to him and then deliver them out to the world. Carnegie also attempted to buy out competing steel producers. In this process, known as horizontal integration, companies producing similar products merged together. Having gained control over his suppliers and having limited his competition, Carnegie came to control almost the entire steel industry. By the time he sold his business in 1901, Carnegie's companies produced by far the largest portion of the nation's steel. Now, here's the kind of interesting thing. Andrew Carnegie says that he doesn't really believe in monopolies, but in effect, in practice, he really did have a monopoly. Here's a little bit more about him from another text. After accumulating some capital, Carnegie entered the steel business in the Pittsburgh area. A gifted organizer and administrator, he succeeded by picking high-class associates and by eliminating many middlemen. Although inclined to be pretty tough-fisted in business, he was not a monopolist and disliked monopolistic trust, supposedly. His remarkable organization was a partnership that involved, at its maximum, about 40 Pittsburgh millionaires. By 1900, he was producing 1/4 of the nation's Bessemer steel, and the partners in these pre-income tax days were dividing profits of $40 million a year as their take-home pay, with Carnegie himself receiving about 25 million of that. Okay, so here's the other interesting thing, that during this same time period, people are taking a look at this Andrew Carnegie story, and they're kind of they're making this into kind of a cultural phenomenon, encouraging people to look at Carnegie as a role model and see it as the path forward for Americans in general. This guy right here, his name's Horatio Alger. And Horatio Alger kind of took this plot from Andrew Carnegie's life and turned it into a series of books that were really popular. So you can see Horatio Alger's name down here, and this is just one of his little dime store novels that were really popular, and the plot was always the same. It was always a kid that through pluck and kind of hard work and honesty took advantages of opportunities that came to him and succeeded in life. So it was the same plot, and it really kind of set the seed in our minds that this is possible in America, and this is the way that people make it. And I would say that, it's true that people can make it through hard work and taking advantage of opportunities, But I think it's built on this notion that this is how people accumulate wealth. And the vast majority of people during the Gilded Age started with wealth. So just like you saw in the video clip you watched of JP Morgan, I mean, that guy starts, his dad is an international banker before JP Morgan becomes as wealthy as he becomes. John D. Rockefeller did not start from absolutely nothing. Okay. What's kind of interesting is that, and we're going to explore the why behind this, but Carnegie comes out of this situation, even though he has practiced this vertical integration and really kind of made it a household name in the business world, and horizontal integration. When John D. Rockefeller does something very similar, John D. Rockefeller is painted in a really negative light. So a lot of times historians have a pretty positive look at Andrew Carnegie and a pretty negative look at John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller gets portrayed in political cartoons from the day as really kind of a monster. And if you look at the techniques that both used, while the techniques were slightly different, they really ended up in the same place. So why is it that Carnegie ends up viewed in a positive light and Rockefeller in such a negative? Andrew Carnegie explained his extraordinary success by pointing to his hard work, his shrewd investments, and his innovative business practices. Late 19th century social philosophers offered a different explanation for Carnegie's success. They said it could be explained scientifically by a new theory called social Darwinism. So first of all, I know that you already know this, but Darwin, there's Charles Darwin. The best adapted survive. You guys know his theory on biological evolution. This is taking Darwin's theory of evolution and adapting it to people in a social context. So a guy named Herbert Spencer builds upon Charles Darwin's work and builds this theory, this kind of social evolution theory, about how and why certain people succeed and others don't. So this is Herbert Spencer. And at the time, he was promoting this theory, you can see it for yourself down on the bottom right, that theorized that people are kind of subject to those same laws of natural selection. He said there's a scientific explanation for why some people around the world are progressing and making more money than other groups of people. These ideas were used initially to point out, the success of people like Charles Darwin. But later on, that became used as kind of a justification for the government not regulating, not getting involved in business affairs, not limiting the amount of money that people can make, not regulating. And it's even used as a justification for things like imperialism and other kind of racist legislation, political laissez-faire, this sorts of things. So it's just discouraging any involvement in regulation or intervention. And today it's viewed as bad science, but then it was accepted as theory. So the philosophy called social Darwinism grew out of the English naturalist Charles Darwin's theory of biological evolution. In his book, The Origin of Species, published in 1859, Darwin described his observations that some individuals and species flourish and pass their traits along to the next generation while others do not. He explained the process of natural selection weeded out the less suited individuals and enabled the best to survive. The English philosopher Herbert Spencer used Darwin's biological theories to explain the evolution of human society. Soon, economists found in social Darwinism a way to justify the doctrine of laissez-faire, a French term that means allowed to do or hands off. According to this doctrine, the marketplace should not be regulated. William G. Sumner, a political science professor at Yale University, promoted the theory that success and failure in business were governed by natural law and that no one had the right to intervene. The premise of a survival and success of the most capable naturally made sense to the 4,000 millionaires who had emerged since the Civil War, because the theory supported the notion of individual responsibility and blame. It also really appealed to this Protestant kind of work ethic of many Americans. According to social Darwinism, riches were a sign of kind of God's favor, and therefore the poor must be lazy or inferior or somehow kind of deserve their lot in life. And I think oftentimes when we see people panhandling or see other signs of kind of visual poverty on the streets, that it's easy for our gut to go to lazy and inferior. And so I'm going to call your attention back to what your first thoughts were when you saw the panhandler at the beginning of the unit, and wonder what your first gut responses were, and whether that social Darwinism is still alive and well in us, and where we see, where do we see problems with the theory, and where do we continue to see kind of a justification of hard work. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to justifying like imperialism and some types of social consequence for this, it can come across as a pretty condescending, kind of patronizing attitude that Anglo-Saxon would have over or demonstrated over other groups of people. Okay, here's a little bit more about social Darwinism, because I think that it takes a while to kind of sink in and really like do some thinking about. So let's listen a little bit more about it. This will last about 8 minutes.
Hey, this is Kim from Khan Academy. I am the history fellow here, and I am here with Emily.
Hi, I'm the biology fellow.
So Emily and I are here talking about Darwinism. And I'm interested in Darwinism because in the late 19th century, I'll usually call the Gilded Age, there is a very prominent interpretation of Darwinism that is called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism wasn't so much an actual form of biology as it was kind of a misinterpretation of how natural selection and the theory of evolution worked that was used to justify or explain a lot of the social inequalities of this time period. And the way people often thought about it was that white Anglo-Saxon people, so Europeans, Northern Europeans, were kind of the most evolved. And this is our timeline of evolution from least evolved to most evolved. And people like African Americans or Asians or Native Americans or even Eastern Europeans were less evolved, that they were on a scale of evolution where they hadn't come as far as Anglo-Saxons. So, Emily, you're a biologist, and I would love to get your take on how it is that natural selection actually works and how this doesn't quite describe what was really going on.
Yeah, definitely. So maybe I can speak first to that specific graph that you've drawn. And I think that this is actually a common point of confusion when it comes to evolution, that there's not really such a thing as more or less evolved in evolution.
Okay, so this gradient really doesn't exist.
No, I mean, there's sort of I think that people sometimes see the pictures of like the ape standing up and turning into a person, and they think, oh, this is sort of a linear path from one thing to another. But what you really get is different types of organisms evolving from a shared ancestor and branching off. So, nobody who's alive on Earth today has been evolving for more or less time since their last common ancestor than anybody else.
So I'm going to draw what I think is how you're explaining this, and please correct me as I go along, but say this is my common ancestor, and then would there possibly be branches like this?
Yeah, that's a great way to draw it. And I mean, certainly humans are all extremely closely related to each other, but like we could even say this for us versus a dog, a bacterium, like pretty much anything. All life on Earth shares a common ancestor, and so that bacteria is just as evolved as you are, actually, in the sense of absolute time, since those two split apart.
Right. So like from the moment that life first appeared on Earth, there has been so much time, and all of us have been evolving from that point. So even whether you're a piece of bacteria, piece a good word, a bacterium.
There you go. Beautiful.
Excellent. A bacterium. I took biology once. Or you are Albert Einstein. You have been evolving for precisely the same amount of time. So awesome. Okay. Wow. I'm really relieved to find that I could describe that as well as I could.
You did a great job. Beautiful.
So you've done this distinction between evolving from a common ancestor. So how is it that the actual theory of natural selection works?
Yeah, that's a great question. So natural selection, often people talk about it as sort of having 3 key ingredients. And to see how it works, let's imagine that we're just looking at a population of beetles. So picture your beetles to start with. And what would we need to have in order for these beetles as a group to evolve by natural selection? So one thing that we would need some variation among the beetles.
Okay.
So if you have identical beetles, you're not going to have any that are better at surviving or reproducing than any others, which is kind of a key ingredient for what we're going to talk about.
Okay. So I've got 2 different beetles here. They're slightly different from each other.
Awesome. And you've made them different colors, which is perfect. So we have variation, and the next ingredient that we're going to need, so we're going to need that variation to be heritable. So we're going to say that those beetles, one of them is green and one of them is blue, and that's because of something in their DNA. So they have differences in their DNA that create the variation in colors.
Okay. So, right. So when you say heritable, you mean that this is something that their descendants could inherit?
Exactly. That is exactly it. So the final ingredient is that the differences, these heritable differences, need to affect how good the beetles are at leaving offspring in the next generation.
Okay.
So, for example, let's say we would probably have more than 2 beetles in our actual population, but let's say this population has just moved into a new area that is very blue colored.
Okay.
So blue rocks, blue flowers, whatever. And there's also a bunch of birds in that environment that really like to eat beetles. And I'm guessing that if they have blue beetles and green beetles, that one of those is going to show up a lot better against the blue environment than the other. So probably a lot of our green beetles are going to get picked off by birds, and they're not going to be able to leave offspring because, gosh, they kind of got at. So when you look at the next generation of beetles, if we know that the colors get passed on, we're going to probably see a bigger group of that, a bigger proportion of that group being made up of blue beetles and less being made up of green. And that is an example of natural selection in action, where you can see that organisms that survive and specifically reproduce better in a certain environment are going to increase in frequency in a population. So you're going to get more and more of these blue guys, less and less of the green guys.
Is there a word you would use to describe this adaptation? Is that the natural selection part, as from variation and heritable? Like the natural selection is just like a good situation?
Yeah, I mean, natural selection is really the differential survival and reproduction.
Okay.
And as you mentioned a great word there, which is adaptation. So adaptation is the word that biologists often give to the process of a population getting better and better suited to its environment. So you would say that the population was adapting to being in a blue space as it gradually started to have more and more blue beetles across generations.
So what I find really interesting about this is that it's entirely by chance, right? More or less, you've got a genetic mutation, and then that mutation happens to suit the environment that you're in, which allows you to thrive, and your genes and your adaptations to be passed on over time.
Yes, and I mean, the variation would have occurred randomly to start with. Like you say, it would have been a mutation. It didn't happen because the beetles went to a blue place and said, gosh, I should be blue. That would be awesome. That was not what happened. It was already there, and it just happened to be successful in that environment. And if they'd gone to a green place, well, guess what? You would have gotten exactly the opposite effect. Suddenly the green guys would have been more successful, more able to leave offspring, and you would have seen green be increasing or quote unquote favored by natural selection.
In the next couple of days, we're going to weave this local history story into our exploration of businesses during the Gilded Age, workers in industry, labor union developing, people fighting for their rights as workers, and all of that kind of comes together in bloodshed in downtown Centralia in 1919.